The wind howled across the desolate plains, carrying with it the cruel sting of winter as snow fell endlessly, blanketing the ground in a cold white silence that seemed to swallow both the living and the dead. And in that silence lay a truth darker than the storm itself, a truth born of superstition, fear, and merciless tradition. For in a small, forgotten village, tucked between the mountains and the endless stretch of frozen fields, a woman was being dragged to her fate, her wrists bound, her cries muffled by the ruthless hands of those who once called themselves her kin. And though her eyes searched desperately among the faces of the crowd for even a spark of compassion, she found none, only cold glares and whispers that hissed the same word over and over. Barren. Barren, barren, as if her inability to bear children had transformed her into a curse upon the earth, a disgrace unworthy of life. And so they chose for her a punishment older than memory itself, a punishment whispered in fireside tales yet still alive in the hearts of those who feared misfortune, the punishment of burial, not in honor but in shame, to lay her beneath the soil as though she had been dead all along, to silence her presence so their fields might flourish, their children might thrive, and their lives might be free from the shadow they believed she cast. And she, trembling and shivering in her thin garments, could do nothing but stumble as the men dragged her out of the village and into the wilderness where the graves of the forsaken lay hidden beneath the snow, her heart pounding not only with terror but with grief, for she had loved once, truly loved, a man who had promised her forever, yet he too had turned against her when her womb betrayed their hopes, and in his rejection, she had lost not only her husband, but her place in a world that valued women only by the children they bore. And though she wanted to scream, to fight, to curse them for their cruelty, her body was weak, starved by neglect, her voice hoarse from days of pleading, and so she fell into silence, her lips moving in prayer though her heart felt abandoned. And when they came to a clearing where the snow had been shoveled aside to reveal the dark earth beneath, she realized with horror that they had already prepared the pit, a shallow grave dug not with reverence but with haste. And as she looked into its black maw, the finality of her fate struck her, the realization that she would not be remembered as a woman, or a wife, or even a human being, but as a barren shadow buried beneath a winter storm. And so when they forced her down into the hole, the cold earth rising on either side like prison walls, she closed her eyes and let the tears fall, her body shivering as the first handfuls of soil landed upon her skirt, heavy, suffocating, each one a cruel reminder that life was slipping from her, that breath itself would soon be stolen by the weight of dirt. And though she begged with her eyes for mercy, none came, for the villagers turned away as though deaf to her silent screams, and soon the snow began to cover her as if the heavens themselves conspired to erase her from memory. Yet somewhere beyond the storm, fate was already weaving a thread that would not allow her story to end in that pit, a thread tied not to the village that condemned her but to a man traveling the road. Nearby, a widowed father burdened by grief and responsibility, his arms weary from the endless care of 4 small children, his heart scarred by the loss of the wife who had once been his anchor. And though he trudged forward through the storm with no thought of miracles, it was he who would become one, for his path was about to cross the frozen ground where the barren woman lay dying, and in that meeting of despair and despair, life itself would carve a new beginning, one written not by tradition or cruelty, but by the defiant power of compassion. The storm had quieted by dawn, leaving behind a world cloaked in silence. The snow stretched endlessly across the land like a shroud of sorrow, but within that stillness a fragile spark of life had been preserved, for the man who had stumbled upon the half-buried woman the night before now sat in the corner of his modest cabin, the firelight flickering across his weathered face as his children huddled close around the stranger he had saved, her breath shallow but steady, her skin pale as the snow outside. And though exhaustion pressed heavily upon him, he kept his vigil, unwilling to let her slip back into the arms of death after dragging her from that frozen grave. For in her frailty he had seen something he knew too well, the look of someone discarded by fate, abandoned to loneliness, left to vanish without a trace, and it stirred within him a fierce determination that surprised even himself. For though he had carried grief since the loss of his wife, though his days had been filled with endless work and the cries of children who longed for the warmth of a mother's touch, he now felt as though the act of saving this woman had breathed into him a forgotten Strength? A purpose beyond mere survival. And as the hours passed, he found himself studying her face, the softness of her features despite the dirt and cold, the way her lips trembled, even in sleep, as if her spirit still fought against the cruelty she had endured. And he wondered what kind of world would cast aside a soul like hers. What kind of hearts could bury a woman alive simply for being barren? And the thought filled him with both rage and sorrow, for he knew too well how society judged, how whispers could condemn, how cruelty often wore the mask of righteousness. But he also knew that perhaps, just perhaps, their meeting was not chance at all but the hand of Providence weaving their broken lives together. And as his children stirred awake, rubbing their eyes and staring curiously at the woman, he gathered them close and whispered gently that she was to be treated